She didn't ask to stay. She didn't ask for any of it. On the 58th day, a moth landed on her hand and stopped living in for seconds. Not because she wanted it to. Because she looked at it the way a child looks at something small and alive, and the look was enough. I watched it happen from the doorway. I had been watching things happen from doorways for months, watching and choosing, each morning, not to say the word that would have sent her back. The word existed. The law existed. The gate was right there, with the rule carved into it by my own hands. I knew the rule. I made the rule. I kept her anyway. There is a law in my kingdom. No mortal shall remain past the third dawn. It is a law of physics. The longer a mortal stays inside an immortal domain, the more the domain presses itself into them, like dye into cloth, like heat into metal. The process is irreversible past a certain point. I knew all of this. I stood in her doorway on the 54th morning and told myself I would say something tomorrow. Tomorrow became day 63. The day her shadow arrived before she did. Tomorrow became day 67, the moth. By the time the council arrived, she had been here 72 days. What she had been when she walked in, barefoot, unafraid, holding a small stone, was no longer what she was. What she is now has no name yet. She is still deciding what to call it. She asked me, on the first day, to remember something for her. She was afraid she was going to lose it. I told her yes. I had no idea what I was also agreeing to. If this story pulled you in, like the video and follow Medusa's Memories. Tell us, what state are you listening from? I should have known by the way she looked at me. Every creature that has ever walked into my presence, human, divine, cursed, or consecrated, has done one of two things. They have looked away immediately, driven by the instinct that precedes reason, the part of the body that knows danger before the mind can name it. Or they have stared too long, paralyzed by something that sits between fascination and terror, frozen mid-breath in the second before stone claimed them. The girl did neither. She stood at the base of the obsidian steps that lead to my hall, her feet bare against the cold black stone, her dress the color of river mud. And she looked at me the way a child looks at a fire, not in fear of burning, in recognition of warmth. I had not been looked at that way in 1100 years. Her name, I learned later, was something plain and unmemorable, the kind of name given to daughters of farmers, who did not expect daughters of farmers to need names that lasted. She had walked 3 days through the western marshes to reach me, alone, without a guide, without a weapon, without an offering. She had nothing in her hands except the dried hem of her dress and a small stone she had been turning over in her fingers since some distant morning I had not witnessed. "Are you the one who remembers?" she asked me. Not, "Are you the monster?" Not, "Are you Medusa?" Not even the whispered prayer they sometimes offer before they realize the prayers won't help. Just that. "Are you the one who remembers?" I told her yes. She sat down on the 3rd step from the bottom and looked out toward the marsh. And she said, "Then I need you to remember something for me, because I'm going to forget it soon, and I don't want to." That was the first day. The kingdom I hold has no official name in the languages of living men. The scholars who have attempted to map it, and there have been several, none of whom returned, have called it by different words depending on their mother tongue: the kingdom of the still, the threshold court, the border of stone. The serpents that form my hair have heard all the names. They remember each one the way they remember everything I have allowed to become part of me over the centuries, perfectly, permanently, without the mercy of forgetting. My kingdom is built on a single law, and that law has been carved into the gate that no living human has ever passed through willingly and survived. No mortal shall remain past the third dawn. The law is not mine. It's me. It was here when I arrived, when I was still raw with the transformation I had not chosen, still learning what I had become and what that becoming would cost me for the rest of time. I did not write the law, but I have enforced it. 11 centuries, and not once has a mortal remained past the third dawn. Until the girl. I tell myself now, and the serpents turn in slow disagreement when I do, that I did not decide to break the law. That it simply happened, the way certain catastrophes happen, not as a single choice, but as an accumulation of small permissions. The first permission, I allowed her to stay the first night. Because it was already dark, and the marsh at night devours the unwary. The second permission, I allowed her to stay the second night. Because in the morning, she had asked me to teach her how to read the old script on the east wall. And I had been waiting for someone worth teaching for so long that I had forgotten I was still waiting. The third permission, I allowed her to stay past the third dawn, and that is when I crossed the line that cannot be uncrossed. She was 7 years old, or close to it. She wasn't certain, which told me her early years had not been carefully counted by anyone, which told me other things I did not want to know. She was thin in the way of children who have been given just enough to not be called starving, and she moved through my holes with the particular fearlessness of someone who has already survived the thing they were most afraid of. I did not know then what that thing had been for her. I know now. I will not say it here. Some histories belong to the person who lived them and no one else. What I will say is this. She was the first being in 11 centuries to sit across from me at the long obsidian table and eat a meal without trembling. I watched her break the bread I provided. I kept provisions for the occasional mortal who came to bargain, though they rarely ate, and I watched her look around my hall with the calm, assessing gaze of a child who is already deciding which corners she would like to explore. The serpents coiled toward her. I expected her to flinch. She reached out and let one of them rest its head against her palm. "It's warm," she said, surprised. I thought they would be cold. Most things people expect to be cold, I told her, are warmer than they imagine. She looked at me then, directly, without the sliding glance that most humans employ when attempting to look at my face, while still believing they can look away in time. She looked at me the way you look at something you have decided to understand. "Did it hurt?" she asked. "When you became like this, 11 centuries." And she was the first to ask that particular question with that particular word. Not, "How did it happen?" Not, "Is the myth true?" Not, "Were you punished? Did it hurt?" "Yes," I said. "I thought so," she said, and returned to her bread. That was the fourth day, the day after the third dawn. The day the law had already been broken and I was only beginning to understand what I had done. The law of the kingdom operates in ways I have never been able to fully explain, even to myself. It is not a law enforced by any guard or any court. It is more like the law of seasons. It does not punish you for defying it. It simply proceeds. The consequence of a mortal remaining past the third dawn is not a tribunal. It is not an execution. It is a slow permeation, like water finding its way through stone. The longer a mortal remains within the boundaries of an immortal's domain, the more the domain's nature begins to press itself into the mortal's own nature, like dye into cloth, like heat into metal. I knew this law. I had known it for 11 centuries. The girl stayed. The weeks that followed were the closest thing to ordinary I have experienced since the morning I woke and found myself changed. She learned. She was extraordinary at learning, voracious, precise, with the kind of memory that borders on its own mythology. She mastered the old script in 12 days, and was reading the wall inscriptions herself by the third week. She named all the serpents. They accepted their names, which surprised me, as they had never accepted names from me. She found the underground spring beneath the east courtyard that I had not known existed, which meant she had explored areas of my own kingdom that I had not fully mapped. She asked me, on the 40th day, why the statues in the outer garden looked so peaceful. I told her they had been people who chose permanence over the uncertainty of continued living. She was quiet for a moment, considering this. "That's not what really happened," she said. "Not an accusation, a clarification." "No," I agreed. "That's not what really happened. But you don't want to tell me the real thing yet." "Not yet." "Okay," she said, and went back to reading. And as she was beginning to change, the first sign was subtle enough that I almost attributed it to the dim lighting of the inner hall. Her shadow, I noticed one morning, was not quite matching her movements. Not drastically. It was not the kind of difference a human I would catch immediately. But I have watched shadows for 11 centuries, and I noticed. Her shadow was a half-beat behind her, and not in the direction of the light source. I told myself it was nothing. The second sign was harder to explain away. One of the younger serpents, the one she had named River, the pale green one that preferred her left shoulder, began following her to the east. Courtyard, each morning without my direction. Serpents do not form attachments. I have shared space with them for 11 centuries, and they have never once sought my company unprompted. They accompany me because I am what I am, because they are part of what I am. They do not choose. And yet River was choosing, every morning, to find the girl and coil at her feet while she read. I stood in the archway one morning and watched. And the girl looked up from her reading and said, without looking at me, she started doing this on her own 2 weeks ago. I didn't ask her to. "I know," I said. "Is that a problem?" I looked at the serpent. I looked at the girl. The light from the east window was catching the ends of her hair at a specific angle. And for a moment, just the space between one breath and the next, the ends of her hair seemed to shift without wind. I told her it was not a problem. That was the 53rd day. And that was when I understood, with the cold specificity of a realization that has been waiting while you looked away, that I had made an error so large and so irreversible that the only question remaining was not how to undo it, but how to understand what it would cost. I had enforced the law of the kingdom for 11 centuries. I knew its mechanisms. I had watched what happened to the rare mortal who attempted to circumvent it, not by remaining willingly, but by being left behind accidentally, by a companion who fled and abandoned them, by a traveler who misjudged the passage of time within my borders, which moved differently than time in the outer world. I had seen the early stages. I had seen the first shadows. I had sent every single one of them back before the process could deepen. Every single one, except her. The question that has no comfortable answer is the one I have been circling since that morning in the east courtyard. Did I not send her back because I did not recognize the signs in time? Or did I recognize them and choose not to see them because I did not want to return her to a world that had already given her sufficient reason to walk alone through 3 days of marsh without a guide? I thought about sending her back on the 54th morning. I stood at the entrance to her sleeping room. She had claimed a small chamber near the underground spring, which meant she had also claimed the sound of running water as her lullaby, which meant something about what she needed that I refused to examine too closely, and I stood there in the doorway. Not quite inside, not quite outside, and I thought, today Today, I will tell her it is time. She was still asleep. Her hair was spread across the dark pillow. And even in sleep, in the low grey light of an early underground morning, I could see that the ends of her hair were not entirely still, not moving dramatically, not obviously, but present. A particular kind of motion at the edges of things, like the motion of air in a room where a window has been left fractionally open. I did not wake her. I told myself I would tell her tomorrow. On the 58th day, a visitor came, not a mortal. Something older. Something that moved through the outer gate without triggering the law of 3 dons, because it was not subject to the law of 3 dons. It arrived in the form it sometimes takes when it wants to be clearly understood. An old woman in grey robes. Her eyes the color of winter sky. Her hands folded in front of her with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry, because time is one of the things it made and can, therefore always find more of. I met it at the gate, and I did not allow it past the gate, and it smiled at me with the patience of something that knows the conversation has already been had in a future I hadn't reached yet. How long? It asked. No preamble. It never bothers with preamble. 58 days, I said. The winter sky. Eyes moved past me toward the inner hall, where the girl was somewhere. Reading or exploring or talking to River in the particular tone she used with the serpent that was half question and half statement. As if she suspected the serpent understood her and was testing the theory. You know what comes next, the visitor said. I know what comes next. And you know the law. I wrote the entry in the gate with my own hands. 60 years after the first time someone failed to follow it, and I was left to manage the consequence. The visitor nodded. It looked at me for a long time with its winter sky eyes and its folded hands. And then it said, "The council has not been informed yet. You have, Jimmy. Not much, but some." It turned and walked back through the gate and was gone before I could ask how much time constituted some. This is also a thing that beings outside of time do when they wish to be maximally unhelpful. They quantify in terms that have no units. The girl was changing, and I had been the one to change her. I spent 3 days following the visitor's departure, trying to determine what had changed. The answer, when I was honest enough to look at it directly, was that nothing had changed. The process had been happening all along. What the visitor had done was name the timeline. The council would learn. The council would act. The unknown variable was how much time I had between those 2 events. And that was the same variable it had always been. I simply had not been counting. I began counting. The signs accelerated the way signs tend to accelerate once you have decided to pay attention to them. Or perhaps they had always been this visible and I had been choosing the particular blindness of the willfully invested. Either way, by day 62, the evidence was no longer something that could be attributed to dim lighting or an unusual angle of shadow. The serpents, all of them, not just River, had begun spending time near her without direction. This alone was unprecedented enough to constitute a crisis, and I had been treating it as a peculiarity. Her shadow, on the morning of day 63, arrived 3 seconds before she did when she walked into the hall. Not behind her, before. The shadow crossed the threshold, established itself on the obsidian floor. And then she followed it into the room, stepped into it, and they aligned as though nothing unusual had occurred. She did not appear to notice. I stood at the far end of the hall and understood, with a clarity that carried the specific cold of certainty rather than fear, that the permeation had passed the point I had been telling myself was still some distance away. "You're looking at me differently," she said, not looking up from her reading. "I'm thinking," I said. "You always say that when something is wrong." This stopped me. I had not realized she had catalogued my tells. I had been watching her for 6 to 3 days and had been so occupied with noting her changes that I had not tracked what she might be noting about mine. "How long have you known something is wrong?" I asked. She set down the scroll, looked at me. "A while," she said. "Since the shadow started." "You noticed the shadow." I noticed my shadow. "I didn't know if yours did it too." "Do they? Do your shadows also not match?" I thought about this. In 11 centuries, I had not examined my own shadow with particular attention. There had never been a reason. "I don't know," I told her. "Then we're both in the same situation," she said, and picked the scroll back up, which was the most terrifying thing she could possibly have said, because it was the first time she had placed herself in any category that included me. The problem, the specific, practical, urgent problem meant refusing to examine because examining it required admitting the full dimensions of what I had allowed to happen. The transformation could not be reversed by simply returning her to the human world. I had believed, for as long as I had been refusing to look directly at the situation, that the solution was straightforward: return her. Remove her from the influence of the domain. Allow the permeation to fade the way permeation fades when its source is eliminated. This is what happens in the early stages. Remove the mortal recovers. The changes dissipate over weeks or months. The person returns to what they were. But that was the early stages. 58 days was not the early stages. And 63 days was further still. The rule of irreversibility, which is written nowhere, because it is the kind of knowledge that is passed between immortals in the particular silence of those who have witnessed what happens when the rule is violated, is this: past a certain threshold of permeation, the mortal's nature does not return to its original state upon removal from the domain. Continues. The transformation, once it crosses the threshold, is no longer dependent on proximity to the source. It has established its own momentum. It will proceed. I did not know exactly where the threshold was. I had never had occasion to learn. I knew, now, that wherever it was, we were past it. The girl would not stop transforming whether she stayed or left. The question was not how to prevent the transformation. It was too late for prevention. The question was what she would become, and who would be there when she became it, and what the world she was being changed into would have to say about the fact that she had not been asked. On day 6 to 7, she turned a moth to stone. She did not mean to. She was sitting in the east courtyard, near the spring, reading. A moth landed on the back of her hand, a large pale moth, the kind that comes through the marsh at this season, soft and inevitable. She looked at it. The way I had looked at things in the first months after my transformation, when I was still learning the precise calibration of my attention, when I was still discovering that looking was no longer the same act it had been before. She looked at it with the specific, focused interest that children bring to small things that have landed on them. The moth stiffened. Its wings stopped their slow breath. Within for seconds it was completely still, its pale wings locked at an angle of arrested flight. Its small body frozen in the last position of living, she stared at it for a very long time. She did not cry. This is one of the things about her that I have never fully understood. She processes devastation first, and then emotion, rather than the other way. And the processing is visible on her face as a particular stillness that reads as calm until you know her well enough to recognize it as the opposite of calm. "It was alive," she said. "Yes, I didn't want that to happen." "I know." Is this going to keep happening? I had been waiting for this question since the morning I had stood in her doorway and chosen tomorrow. I had been composing the answer in the hours between then and this moment, trying to find a version that was accurate and also not the thing it actually was, which was a confirmation that I had failed her in the most complete way available to me. There is no version of this answer that is not that, and I had known that for some time, and knowing it had not made finding the words any easier. Yes, I said. It will keep happening unless you learn to control it. And learning to control it will take time, and time is... I paused. Time is the thing we may not have enough of. She looked at the moth. She lifted her hand very carefully and placed it on the edge of the fountain's basin, and the stone moth rested there against the dark stone. Its wings still open, still stopped, preserved in a moment it had not chosen. She looked at it for another long moment. Then she looked at me, who decides how much time we have. A council, I said. A group of beings older than either of us. They enforce the law that I broke when I let you stay past the third dawn. They have been, I have been made aware. Her expression changed in a way I had not seen before. Not fear, exactly. Something more complex. The look of someone who has just been given information that reorganizes everything. They thought, they understood about their situation. What does that mean for you? She asked. Not, what does it mean for me? For you? I don't know precisely, I said, which was honest. The council's penalties for violations of the law of 3 dawns were not standardized in any written form. They were proportional to the offense, and the offense in this case was, to say the least, proportional to 6 to 7 days. What does it mean for me? She asked. Now, I could not answer this directly. Not because I didn't know, but because what I knew was not yet the final version. It was still the version in which possibilities existed, in which the outcome was still technically plural, in which the word hope could still be used in the same sentence as her name without it becoming a lie. It means, I said carefully, that we need to decide some things before they decide for us. She nodded. She looked at the stone moth again. She said, I wish I could give it back. I know. Can you give things back? No, I said. Once it's done, it's done. She absorbed this. I watched her absorb it, watched the information settle into the same place, where she had been storing everything else about her new situation, building the architecture of understanding with a speed and a precision that continued to astonish me. That continued to constitute one of the specific losses of this particular catastrophe. She was extraordinary, and the world of humans who might have witnessed her and been changed for the better by witnessing her was now close to her. Because a stone moth is only the beginning, and you cannot live among people who are afraid of what your attention can do. On day 6 to 9, I sent a communication to a being I had not spoken to in 400 years, not to the council itself. To an intermediary, someone old enough to know the council's internal logic and reliable enough, barely, to tell me something resembling the truth about what was coming. The response came that same evening, carved into the stone of the outer gate in letters that appeared in the space between one moment and the next. It said, they come to collect what belongs to the law. I stood at the gate and read these words for a long time. The serpents had gathered around me without my noticing, which was something they did when they understood that the moment was significant enough to require their full collective attention. What does it mean to collect what belongs to the law? The girl asked from behind me. She had followed me to the gate, which she had never done before. She read the words before I could decide whether to show them to her or find a way to describe them in softer terms. I turned and looked at her in the fading light. She was standing very straight. Her hair was not quite still. River was wound around her left forearm in the particular way the serpent had adopted as a default position, and the pale green scales caught the last of the light in a way that suggested it was no longer entirely clear where the serpent ended and she began. It means they believe you have been transformed enough to fall under a different jurisdiction, I said. Not the human world. Not my kingdom, the space between. What's in the space between? Nothing I would choose for you, I said. She looked at me for a very long time. Then she sighed, then don't let them put me there. And this was the impossible dilemma. The specific shape of the thing I had been circling for 69 days without looking at its center. I could fight the council, which would protect her in the short term and destroy us both in the long term. Or I could surrender her to the council's jurisdiction, which would preserve me and deliver her to the space between, which is the precise kind of fate that the word between was invented to avoid describing. Both options destroyed something I did not know how to name yet, and would not name for another 3 days. When the council arrived and the choice became no longer theoretical. The serpents watched me from the archway. They had been watching me all day. The way they watch when they know I am at the edge of the kind of decision that does not have a correct version, only a chosen one and a consequence. I have made decisions like this before, in 11 centuries. They always feel the same from the inside, like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark. Knowing the ground is below but unable to see how far, unable to know if what is below is solid or water or nothing at all. What I had not anticipated in 11 centuries of watching humans make catastrophic choices for the people they loved was that I would one day understand those choices from the inside. That I would stand in my own gate with a girl's impossible words still in the air. Then don't let them put me there, and feel, with a specificity I had no prior experience of, that particular human terror, the terror of caring enough, that all available options become terrible, and still being required to choose. The council arrived on the morning of day 72, and they arrived the way the council always arrives, already in the middle of the hall. They did not pass through the gate. They did not announce themselves. They were simply there when I walked into the main hall in the gray pre-dawn light, for beings arranged in a semicircle at the center of the obsidian floor. Each one wearing the form it had selected for this occasion. Each form designed to be perceived as authoritative without being threatening, which is the council's preferred calibration because it keeps the accused calm until the moment when calm is no longer necessary. I had expected them. I had not expected them this soon, which was the detail I should have anticipated, because the council has never arrived when expected. Arriving as expected is a courtesy, and the council's relationship with courtesy is essentially the same as its relationship with mercy. They understand the concept in an academic sense and have no use for it in practice. The girl was in her room. I knew this because River was not in the hall, and River had not left the girl's side since the night she turned the moth to stone. I had approximately 4 minutes, maybe 5, before she woke and came looking for breakfast or for me, whichever she found first. "You know why we're here," said the one on the left, which was not using a specific form so much as the suggestion of a form, tall, gray at the edges, a face that assembled itself correctly when you looked at it directly, but dissolved into suggestion at the periphery. "The law of 3 dawns," I said. "The law of 3 dawns," it confirmed. "The mortal has exceeded the lawful limit by 69 days. The permeation has crossed irreversibility." She is no longer classifiable as mortal. She is not classifiable as immortal, either, I said. You said it yourself. The space between. The space between is where things that belong to neither category reside, said the one at the center. This one had chosen a more concrete form, an older man in robes the color of slate, with the kind of eyes that have been watching things long enough to have stopped registering them as remarkable. It is not a punishment. It is an accuracy. She's a child, I said. Whatever accuracy she is also a child. She was a child when she arrived, the one on the right said. This one had chosen no form at all. It spoke from the air, which was its preference, which was also maximally unnerving, which was intentional. What she is now is the consequence of a violation of the law. My violation, I said. The consequence should be mine. Silence. This was the argument I had been preparing for 3 days. The argument was legally coherent within the council's own framework. Accountability follows the decision-maker, not the affected party. I had made the decision to break the law of 3 dons. The girl had made no decision. She had been a child who arrived at a gate and was permitted to stay when she should not have been. If consequence was proportional to culpability, then the consequence belonged to me. The argument was also, I knew as I made it, incomplete. Because the transformation of the girl was not a punishment that could be redirected. It was not a penalty imposed by the council. It was a natural consequence of proximity to an immortal domain, and it had already happened, and it could not be transferred to me no matter how correct my legal reasoning was. She was what she was regardless of who was at fault for it. The council knew this. The council had known this before I said anything. They were listening to my argument with the patience of those who are willing to let you make your case because they already know the outcome. Your culpability is noted, the center one said. Your penalty will be addressed separately. What penalty? I asked. That depends on the resolution of the primary matter. It said, tell us what you want. This was not what I expected. In 11 centuries of understanding the council, in the handful of times I had been in their presence, and the many more times I had observed what they did to others, I had never heard them invite the party in violation to state what they wanted. They stated what would happen. They gave options when options existed, and those options were always framed in terms of what the council was willing to permit, not in terms of what the offending party desired. Tell you what I want, I repeated. You have broken a significant law and produced a significant consequence, the center one said. You are also one of the oldest, stable presences in a domain we do not wish to destabilize. Pragmatism occasionally overrides precedent. What do you want? I understood then why the visitor 3 days earlier had said I had some time. This had been the time for me to figure out what I was willing to ask for. I had spent those 3 days building and dismantling various answers. And every answer I built had the same fundamental structure. It preserved something at the cost of something else. And the cost was always either the girl's future or my own. And both of those options had felt, in the privacy of the past 3 days, equally impossible. Before I could answer, I heard bare feet on obsidian. The girl had woken early. She had come looking. She walked into the hall and stopped when she saw the council arranged across the floor. And I watched her assess them with the same calm, evaluating gaze she had brought to her first look at me, the look that says, I see you. I am deciding how to understand you, and I have not yet decided to be afraid. River was wound around her forearm, the pale green scales catching the hall's dim light. Her hair was not still. It moved in the particular way it had been moving since day 60. slow and self-directed, each strand following its own logic in the still air. The council saw her, and I watched their forms collectively adjust. A minute recalibration. The way attention recalibrates when it encounters something outside its expected parameters. "She's further than we were told," the air one said. "The information was accurate at the time of report," the gray edge one said. "She's not what we came to classify," the center one said, and there was, for the first time in this conversation, something in its voice that was not exactly what I would call surprise. The council does not surprise easily, but was the thing adjacent to surprise that beings without genuine affect experience when reality outpaces their calculation. The girl looked at me. "These are the council?" she asked. "Yes," she nodded. She turned back to look at them. "What are you going to do with me?" she asked, directly, in the particular tone she used when she had already decided that there was no version of information that was too difficult to receive. This was one of the things about her that had never changed. Not through 62 days of accumulating strangeness. She was constitutionally committed to knowing the actual situation. "That is what we are determining," the center one said. "What are the options?" she asked. I had not expected her to be the one to ask this. I had been preparing to ask it myself. She had simply arrived and moved the conversation to the point I had been walking toward. And the efficiency of it was so completely her that I felt something shift in my chest at exactly the wrong moment. The center one looked at her for a long time. Then it looked at me. I thought I understood then what it was doing, recalculating. The girl it had arrived to classify was a category. The girl standing in front of it with a serpent on her arm and hair that moved on its own and a direct question in the air between them was something else. Categories are easy. Exceptions require different thinking. "The options," it said at last, "are 3. The girl goes to the space between, which is where things of mixed nature reside. Or the girl goes back to the human world with a binding place on what she has become, a suppression, held in place by ongoing intervention, requiring a guarantor who would commit indefinitely." It paused. "Or the girl remains here, within this domain, formally reclassified, which would require her to accept what she is becoming fully and completely, with no further possibility of return to the human world." The room held very still. The serpents, all of them now, not just River, they had emerged from their various places and gathered near the floor of the hall, were motionless, in the particular way of things paying absolute attention. "What does the space between feel like?" the girl asked. "We cannot say," the air one said. "Beings in the space between have not been able to communicate the experience in terms we can relay. So you don't know if it's bad. We know it is accurate." She turned to look at me. "What's the binding?" "A suppression," I said carefully, "of what you're becoming. It would hold what's happening inside you in a state of suspension. You would appear human. You would be able to return to human life. But underneath the suppression, the transformation would continue. It would be real and present and contained, for as long as the binding held." "And the guarantor," she said. "Who would that be?" I had known the answer to this since the center one said the word. There was only one being in this hall who had already violated one law on her behalf, and who had sufficient standing with the council to serve as a guarantor of an ongoing intervention. "Me," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then, if you're my guarantor, what does that mean for you?" "It means I'm responsible for maintaining the binding, indefinitely. It means that whatever penalty the council intends for me, for the violation of the law of 3 dawns, is replaced by the obligation of the guarantee. So you'd be attached to me forever, or until the binding breaks. Or until you choose otherwise, I said. She looked at the center one. What happens if the binding breaks? What was suppressed continues, it said, more rapidly than it would have if it had never been suppressed. She was quiet, processing. I watched it happen, the information being organized, the implications being followed through their various branches, the specific stillness of a mind working harder than its expression was showing. And the third option, she said, staying here, being reclassified. You would be what you are, the center one said. Fully, without suppression, within this domain, under its rules. You would not be mortal. You would not be the class of being that I am. You would be a third kind of thing, which we would need to name. Would you let me name it? She asked. The council did not answer this immediately. I realized they had not anticipated that question. It was the second time in this conversation that she had moved faster than the room expected. Potentially, the center one said, at last. She turned to me. Her hair moved. River adjusted its position on her arm with the slow certainty of something that has already made its decision. If I stay, she said, and I become what I'm becoming, fully, can I still learn? Can I still read the old script? Can I still come to the spring in the morning? Yes, I said. My voice was steadier than it had any right to be. And you'd still be here. I'd still be here. She looked at me for a long time. Something was happening in her expression that I could not fully name. It was too many things simultaneously. Too many of them things I did not have adequate language for. Because the language I had spent 11 centuries building was a language for observing, for recording, for remembering. And what was happening in her face was something that needed a different vocabulary entirely. She turned back to the council. I'll take the third one, she said. The council received this without expression. The center one nodded once. The gray edge one made a sound that was not quite a word. The air one said nothing, which was its version of agreement. Then we proceed to the reclassification. The center one said, Medusa. You understand what this means for your kingdom standing with the council? Yes, I said. Your domain now contains two beings of non-standard classification. Your responsibility is doubled. I understand. The violation of the law of 3 dawns will be recorded, but not penalized. Given the circumstances and the chosen resolution, this will not be available as precedent. Understood? The center one looked at the girl for a long moment. You may name what you are, it said, when you know what it is. She nodded. Then the council was gone, the way they had arrived, without transition, without process, simply no longer in the hole. The girl and I stood in the silent hole. The serpents began to move again, slowly, resuming their various places. River lifted its head and pressed it briefly against her cheek, and she let it. Are you angry? She asked me. No, I said. You look like something. I am something, I said. I'm trying to identify it. I'll tell you when I figure out what I am, she said. Then you can tell me what you are. We'll compare. I did not say anything. She walked past me toward the east courtyard, where the spring was, where the stone moth still rested on the edge of the basin with its wings open in their permanent, arrested flight. And I understood, standing in the hall with the serpents, returning slowly to their places around me, that the thing I was feeling was not anger, and not relief, and not quite grief, though it contained elements of all 3. It was something more specific. It was the particular weight of having been shown, at great cost. That the thing I had been afraid of caring about had already been cared about, and that there was nothing left to do but proceed. The reclassification was not an event. It was a process, and the process took 3 weeks. And during those 3 weeks, the kingdom itself seemed to adjust, the way a house adjusts to a new weight in an old floor, settling into a different distribution that becomes, over time, simply the way it is. I had expected the transformation to be visible in large ways, to see her change dramatically in a short time. The way the stories describe transformations, sudden, total, before and after separated by a clear line. This is not how it works. I know how it works, because it happened to me. And I remember every increment of it with the perfect clarity of the thing that changed the architecture of what I was, and none of it was dramatic. All of it was slow, a degree at a time, like water temperature changing in a large vessel. By the time the change is complete, you cannot locate the moment it happened. You can only locate the distance between where you started and where you are now. She still woke up every morning and came to the spring. She still read. She still talked to River with the half-questioned tone that had never resolved itself into certainty about whether the serpent understood her. The differences accumulated beneath the surface of the ordinary days, the control she was learning. Incrementally, over the stillness in her gaze, learning to choose when it was active, when it was quiet, the way I had learned in my own first years. The hair, which no longer required my attention to identify, as changed. It moved now with a clarity that was simply visible. Simply part of what she was, unhidden and unremarkable in the interior of the domain, where nothing required hiding. And the names. The stone beings in the outer garden, the ones I had told her, in the beginning, had chosen permanence over continued living. She went to them on the 5th day after the council's departure, and she stood in front of each one, and she named them. Not their original names. I did not know their original names. Most of them I had been keeping as the law required, maintained in their transformed state. Tended to in the way of all things within my kingdom that could not be returned to what they were. She looked at each one and gave them a name that reflected what she saw in their faces, which were still faces, still people. Still the specific person each of them had been, preserved in the moment, before the permanence. She named them with the careful seriousness she brought to everything she had decided was worth doing. She moved from one to the next across the garden in the morning light, and the serpents followed her at a distance, and I watched from the archway. And the specific feeling that had been building since the morning of the stone moth settled in my chest as a permanent occupant. "They can hear me," she said when she finished, without turning around to confirm I was there. She had developed an awareness of where I was in the kingdom at most times, which was new, and which I was still adjusting to. "Can't they?" "I don't know," I said. "I think they can. The garden feels different when someone is in it than when no one is." She turned to look at me. "Do you know that feeling?" "Yes," I said. "I've always known it." "I thought you might," she said. "You're very aware of when someone is present and when they're not." This was true, and I had not named it. I had spent 11 centuries aware of presence and absence as a matter of necessity, knowing when something living had entered my domain, when it had left, when it had stopped living, and I had never thought of this awareness as something other than a function. She had just named it as a feeling. On the 12th day after the council's departure, she named what she was. She came to find me in the map room, where I had been doing the kind of work that requires my attention not because it is particularly demanding, but because it provides the structure of doing something specific with the hours. She sat down across from me and put her hands flat on the table and said, I figured out what to call it. What to call what? I asked, though I knew. What I am. The council said I could name it. They did. She considered. I am a rememberer, she said, but one that started without memories. So everything I collect from now on is the first version. Nothing before to compare it to. Just what's here, what's now, added on. I looked at her. A living archive, I said. Yes, like you, but newer. The irony of it, the specific shape of it, settled over me with a weight. I had been expecting, and had still not, found a way to prepare for. I was a living archive, as she said. I was a being that remembered everything, that had accumulated 11 centuries of everything, that existed in part as a repository for what would otherwise be lost. And I had spent 11 centuries alone in that function, with no mirror for it, no equivalent. No one else who understood from the inside what it was to be the thing that holds the record when everything else forgets. And now there was one, a new one, assembled, accidentally, by the particular series of choices I had made and failed to make across the course of 72 days. She was looking at me with the evaluating look. You're doing the thing again, she said. Where you're feeling something and you're deciding whether to say it. Yes, I said. You can say it. I am aware, I said carefully, that I made a significant error. That I should have sent you back before the third dawn. That what you are now is, in large part, the consequence of my failure to do the thing I knew I should. Yes, she said. And I am also aware that I cannot fully be sorry for it, which is its own problem. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I walked 3 days through a marsh alone to find you, she said. Because I had something I needed someone to remember for me. Do you remember what it was? I did. I remember everything. Yes, I said, and you've been keeping it. Yes, good, she said. She put her hands back flat on the table. Then we're both keeping things for each other. That seems like what this is. That seems like the right name for it. I did not answer. She was right, and she was 7 years old, or close to it. And she had named the thing more precisely than I had in 11 centuries of being it. And the weight in my chest was not grief and not guilt, though it contained both. It was the specific and previously unknown feeling of being seen by something small enough that it should not have been able to see that far. The truth of what I had done existed in 2 versions, and I have spent the months since that morning turning them both over, trying to decide which one is the true version, or whether both are true at once, which is also a thing that happens with certain kinds of knowledge. The first version, I failed to send a child back when I should have. I broke a law I had kept for 11 centuries, because I wanted something I did not have language for. And the consequence of that failure was that a child who had no say in the matter was transformed irreversibly into something the human world will never accept. The second version. A child who had already survived the thing she was most afraid of walked 3 days through a marsh and found the one place where what she carried could be held. And I was too slow to prevent her from becoming what she needed to become to stay in that place. And now she is here, and she is a living archive. And the garden has a different quality when she is in it. And the serpents follow her with the self-direction they have never extended to me. And she is learning to control the stillness in her gaze with a speed that suggests she will surpass my own control within 2 years. Both of these versions are true. They are not in conflict. This is the hardest thing I have learned in 11 centuries. And a child who names herself a living archive learned it faster than I did. Two true things can coexist, without one erasing the other, and the task of living with them is not to choose which one is real but to carry both. The statues in the outer garden have names now. The stone moth on the edge of the basin has a name too. She named it on the 8th day, in the same serious way she named the others. She tends to them. She says good morning to them when she passes. This may seem strange from the outside. From the inside of the kingdom, it seems simply accurate. The last thing I will tell you is the thing she remembered that she needed me to hold. On the first day, she sat on the 3rd step and said she had something she was going to forget soon, and she didn't want to. She had asked me to hold it, the way you ask an archive to hold something you are afraid will be lost. She remembered her mother's voice. Specifically, the sound her mother made when she laughed at something that genuinely surprised her. Not the ordinary laugh, the specific one, the involuntary kind. The kind that happens when delight occurs without warning. She remembered this sound, and she was afraid. As the years moved forward and the memory of her mother became a more general shape, and less a specific presence, that she would lose the particular precision of it. The quality that made it her mother's laugh, and not simply the general category of laugh. I have held it for the months since she told it now. I will tell you what it sounded like. Brief, surprised, starting higher than it ended, with a particular catch in the middle that was specific to her, that no one else's laugh had. I have never heard it directly. I have only held her daughter's description of it, which is itself a kind of translation, but translations can preserve more than we give them credit for. The girl does not need me to hold it anymore. She has found that keeping something near a living archive means the memory sharpens rather than fades. She will remember that laugh for as long as she lives, which is going to be a very long time. This is the thing I did not know how to foresee when she sat on the 3rd step with her plain name and her bare feet and her small stone and asked me if I was the one who remembered. I am, and now, so is she. There are still things in this kingdom I have never shown her. Places I have not taken anyone. Old rooms where the stone is older than I am, where the writing predates the law and predates me, and records things that no living being has translated since the language became extinct. I have not shown her these rooms yet, but I think I will, when she is ready. And I think she will be ready sooner than I expect. She usually is. I have been asked, by beings who became aware of the reclassification, what I would do differently. It is the question that circles every significant era, the retrospective interrogation of choices that cannot be unmade. I have given this question the consideration it deserves, which is to say, I have given it 11 months of mournings. My answer is this: I would have been honest sooner about what I was feeling on the 4th day. When she returned to her bread without ceremony after asking me if it hurt to become what I am, I would have named it then, the specific thing that had begun in my chest in the moment she asked that particular question with that particular word. Because naming it earlier would not have changed the outcome but would have changed the quality of the 53 days between that morning and the morning of the stone moth. I would have known what I was protecting from the beginning, rather than discovering it at the cost of the thing I was protecting. This is not a lesson I am confident I would have been able to learn without the error. This is the thing about the certain category of mistakes. They are the only way to learn the specific knowledge they contain. You cannot be taught the weight of caring about something by being told the weight of caring about something. You can only be taught it by caring about something and then living with what that costs. I have lived with it. I am still living with it. The girl is in the east courtyard. I can hear her talking to River, the half-question tone. The living sound of someone testing the boundaries of what can be understood between very different kinds of beings. The sound carries through the stone. I have decided to count that as something. If this story reached your heart, leave us a like and share it. What would you have done? And don't miss what comes next. Another memory Medusa never forgot.